Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the plenary session 3 of the 2021 Jeju-Forum. My name is Chang Seon-yong. I'm your MC for this event. It is my great honor to be your MC for this event. This plenary session 3 will be held under the theme of the peaceful ending of the Cold War, interpretations and lessons. So now I would like to invite our moderator, Chairman Kim Sung-hwan of International Peace Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Thank you, Ms. Zhang, for your kind introduction. My name is Sung-hwan Kim. As just our MC mentioned, I'm the moderator of this session. And I wish to welcome all of you and thank you for joining this session. As you remember, Cold War ended peacefully and unexpectedly already 30 years ago. So this session will seek to understand why and how Cold War ended peacefully. To this end, we invited 4 world-renowned scholars in this session. They will identify the factors that contributed to the peaceful ending of the Cold War in Europe and find ways to emulate these factors in Northeast Asia, where Cold War has not yet ended. So let me introduce our speakers today. Dr. Archie Brown is Emeritus Professor of Politics at Oxford University and author of numerous books and articles on communism and Cold War. And Dr. Melvin Leffler is Emeritus Professor of Virginia University and author of several books on the Cold War and the US relations with Europe. Dr. Svetlana Savranskaya is a senior analyst at the National Security Archive at the George Washington University and the director of the Archive Russia program. And Dr. Ha Young-sun is the chairman of the board at the East Asia Institute and the professor emeritus of the Seoul National University. So Professor Brown, Professor Leffler, and Dr. Savranskaya will make around 10 minutes presentation each, and the Professor Ha will make his comments and questions on the presentations. After each presentation, as a moderator, I will make one question to each speaker, and we will have questions from the audience if time permits. Then let us start with Professor Brown. Professor Brown, floor is yours.
Right. I've got 6 points to make, and the first one is the crucial importance of engagement. I spent a lot of time in Moscow and Leningrad in the 1960s, and at that time there was still fear and hatred of Germany. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million citizens in a war that ended just 2 decades earlier. And what made a very big difference was Willy Brandt becoming Chancellor of West Germany in 1969. And he proceeded to engage with communist Europe, and in the first place with the East German regime and with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. And Brandt, I think without Brandt, without that policy, it's inconceivable that the Soviet Union would have accepted the unification of Germany in 1990. Brandt had an anti-Nazi war record, and he earned a good deal of trust on the part of the Soviet leadership. So Germany began to perceive differently. There was an acceptance that Germany had changed and wasn't the kind of threat it had been in the past. The second point I want to make is that the idea that the Cold War ended because of President Reagan's military buildup is, I think, wrong. The idea that the Soviet Union had no alternative but to accept defeat in the Cold War is, I think, an illusion. There were alternatives. In the immediate post-war period, the United States had nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union did not. But that was a time when the Soviet Union was busily acquiring client states in Central and Eastern Europe. In the 1950s and 1960s, the United States still had military superiority over the Soviet Union, but communism expanded and Soviet influence increased. It was in the early 1970s that a rough military parity was acquired by the Soviet Union with the United States. And that approximate military parity still existed when Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader in 1985. So why should we accept and recognize that the Soviet Union didn't give in, but indeed continue to expand its influence at a time when the Americans had military superiority, but somehow it was forced more or less to surrender at a time when it had parity with the United States and each side could destroy the other completely. My third point is that it's argued that economic slowdown forced the Soviet Union to reform and to end the Cold War. Well, for Mikhail Gorbachev particularly, there were good economic and political reasons for ending the Cold War, but it wasn't easy to win the battle within the Soviet establishment. He had to be a very skillful politician indeed to persuade the powerful military-industrial complex to make concessions, for example, getting rid of intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe. There was a real battle with the old Soviet party state machine. The other reason why it's wrong to see an economic determinist argument as valid is that the Soviet Union didn't actually fundamentally change the economic system under Gorbachev. Gorbachev proceeded to give priority to political reform, not economic reform. So the fact that Russia became a freer country was very positive indeed, but it did nothing to improve the economy. Fourth point, Margaret Thatcher played a more important role in ending the Cold War than you would expect a British Prime Minister to play, given the disparity between Britain's military strength and that of the two military superpowers. The Soviet Army newspaper called Margaret Thatcher in the 1970s the Iron Lady, but Margaret Thatcher's own 10 Downing Street foreign policy advisor, Sir Percy Craddock, thought that she'd become too uncritical of Gorbachev, the Soviet leader. And it's true that she established excellent relations with Gorbachev, even though they argued vigorously about nuclear weapons and other matters. And she was also, and that was crucial, Ronald Reagan's favorite foreign leader. Reagan called Thatcher his soulmate. So she was able to influence Reagan and strengthen his view that it was desirable to engage with the Soviet leadership. And in that sense, she was an ally of those within the Reagan administration, such as Secretary of State George Schultz, most notably Schultz and the State Department, and she did nothing to strengthen the argument of the Defense Department and the CIA, who were extremely skeptical, to say the least, about any good coming out of engagement with the Soviet Union. The fifth point is that Ronald Reagan's presidency overlapped with 4 Soviet leaders, the last 2 years of Leonid Brezhnev, then Andropov, then Chernenko, and then Gorbachev. And nothing changed for the better in East-West relations or in the Soviet political system until Gorbachev became Soviet leader. Now that in itself suggests that the Gorbachev factor was rather more important than the Reagan factor. And we know enough about the other full members of the Soviet Politburo at the time when Chernenko died to know that none of them would have embraced democratization of the Soviet political system. None of them would have raised expectations in Eastern Europe through greater political tolerance and reform at home and through the transformation of Soviet foreign policy. None of them would have raised expectations in the way Gorbachev did in his major speech to the United Nations in December 1988, when he said that the people of every country had the right to decide for themselves what kind of political and economic system they wished to live in. My sixth and final point, Gorbachev's words in 1988 were matched by his deeds in 1989. The Cold War began with the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe just after the Second World War. It ended when those countries became independent and non-communist in the course of 1989, without a shot being fired by a Soviet soldier. So the Cold War ended ideologically with Gorbachev's speech at the UN in December 1988. It ended concretely when the countries of Eastern Europe became independent in the course of '89. And it ended symbolically, I would argue, with the Malta summit in December 1989 between George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev, which finished with the two leaders standing side by side and giving a joint press conference, not as adversaries anymore, but as partners. So the relations of trust that were established in those years are now a distant memory. But the new thinking that Gorbachev embraced is, I would argue, as relevant today as it was then. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brown. You emphasized the importance of engagement. And interestingly, you talked about British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's support for dialogue with the Soviet leadership. It is not much known to us. So can you explain what role did she play and how? And if possible, and if you can give any idea for South Koreans how to persuade United States and North Korea to talk with each other. Can you make an answer to that? Yeah.
I'll try, but of course, I think the first thing one must say is that there's a big difference between Gorbachev and Kim Jong-un. I do think the Thatcher argument for engagement does have some general application, that within every regime, even a highly authoritarian regime, there are people of different views behind the monolithic facade that the regime presents to the outside world. The more you demonize the regime and refuse to engage with it, the harder it becomes for those people to exercise any influence at all. Even in Brezhnev's time in the Soviet Union, there was some contact between Soviet party intellectuals and people in the West, and those people were influenced by their travel. But Margaret Thatcher played a role because she was so close to Ronald Reagan, and they agreed on a great many things. And she was persuaded partly by academics in a seminar in which I took part, that the more contacts, the better, and that Gorbachev was a likely future Soviet leader and would be a reformer. So she had the advantage that she met Gorbachev a year before Reagan did, and in that period especially, she was able to persuade Reagan that this was a man to do business with, in the words she used. So I think that it is an example. I mean, Margaret Thatcher was a hardliner. She was no friend of communism, but she did play a role. And I think for a South Korean leader to establish and keep good relations with the President of the United States, but also in some ways mediate and urge in the United States the importance of dialogue rather than aggression, which would endanger South Korea more than it would endanger the United States, that would probably be reasonably good advice.
Thank you so much. And then we'll hear next speaker, Professor Leffler. Professor Leffler, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the sponsors of this forum for inviting me. I'm really delighted to participate. I'd love to be there in person. I've never been to Korea, and this would have been a lovely opportunity. Nonetheless, I'm very, very happy to be able to make a contribution. So the focus of this particular session is on lessons and interpretations regarding the peaceful end of the Cold War. I would say that the first lesson is never give up hope. In the early 1980s, peace advocates were angry and they were demoralized. Nobody expected the Cold War to end anytime soon. But within a decade, it did end. So champions of peace need to keep the faith. They need to persevere. They need to be resilient. I think that's one important lesson. A second important lesson is to be open-minded, to be ready to accept new ideas and new interpretations based on facts and based on evidence. Let me discuss this point in relation to President Reagan. Nobody in the early 1980s thought that Reagan wanted to end the Cold War, but he did. Nobody thought he wanted to help end the Cold War, but he did. At the time, people thought Reagan wanted to build up America's military strength in order to win the arms race and to intimidate the Soviet Union. People had very good reason to think this. When Reagan first came into office, one of the most important things he did was to call for a huge military buildup. More than just a military buildup, he also called for the modernization of America's nuclear arsenal. But Reagan said all the time that he wanted to build military strength not to win an arms race, but to enable him to negotiate from strength. Few believed him. I did not believe him. Reagan thought that his adversaries in the Kremlin only respected military strength. This assumption may or may not have been true. But building up military strength boosted, enhanced Reagan's own self-confidence. And what we now know is that President Reagan earnestly, sincerely wanted to negotiate. He feared nuclear war and he wanted peace, on his terms, of course, but he wanted peace. For Reagan, military strength undergirded his ability to negotiate. At the time, people thought that Reagan detested Soviet leaders, that he hated them, that he would not deal with them. They had reason to think this. In one of his very first press conferences, he said, every Soviet leader, from Lenin to Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev himself, everyone was a liar and a cheater. But while he said these things publicly, we now know that he wanted to engage Soviet leaders privately, every single one of them, not just Gorbachev, but Gorbachev's predecessors. He wanted to engage Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernyayev. Reagan wrote secret, private letters, often in his own handwriting. And he asked Soviet leaders or told them that he really wanted to negotiate. Despite Reagan's public rhetoric, he wanted to engage the leaders of the evil empire, although very few people at the time knew that. People thought that Reagan wanted to undermine the Soviet system or break up the Soviet Union. But we now know that he yearned to find common interests with Russian leaders. He wanted peace and prosperity. Most of all, he wanted nuclear abolition. And Reagan learned to appreciate the security fears and worries of Soviet leaders. In fact, in 1984, he wrote in his diary, "I've been president for 3 years, and one of the things that most surprises me is that I'm learning that the Soviet leaders really do fear the United States." He found this unbelievably surprising. When ambassadors came to see him in the Oval Office of the White House, he sometimes asked them, "Is it really true that Soviet leaders fear the United States?" And one after another ambassador said, "Yes, they really do." Reagan learned empathy. He spent time reading memoranda that were prepared for him on Russian history, on Russian culture, and on the Russian language. He wanted to understand his adversary. People at the time thought that Reagan loved freedom, democracy, and capitalism, and that he wanted to destroy communism as a way of life. Reagan did hate communism, but he believed in peaceful, evolutionary change. Once Gorbachev and Shevardnadze came to power, Reagan's Secretary of State, George Schultz, spent a lot of time at his meetings with Gorbachev and especially with Shevardnadze, talking to them about how capitalism works. Schultz explained to them how capitalism functioned, how it nurtured technological innovation, how the incentive systems of capitalism spurred modernization and prosperity. Reagan and Schultz were not promoting revolution. They were promoting slow evolutionary change. They had modest expectations. Finally, people thought that Reagan supported the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, or what we now call ballistic missile defense, because he wanted to bankrupt the Soviet Union, or because he wanted the United States to be in a better position to launch a preemptive attack. If the United States could defend itself against Soviet retaliatory strike, then the United States, people thought, could win a nuclear war. That's what people thought Reagan was thinking. But we now know that that was not true. In fact, actually, Reagan was ready to share the technology that was being developed for the Strategic Defense Initiative. He was willing to share it with the Kremlin. He said so. Whether he would have or not is another matter. But he shocked his advisors by saying that he earnestly believed it. Few people understood how much Reagan really wanted to end the Cold War and modulate the arms race and bring about nuclear abolition. Few grasped at the time how much he feared nuclear war. But once he started negotiating with Gorbachev, Gorbachev understood this. Gorbachev came to see that Reagan was sincere. And Gorbachev came to feel that if he signed agreements with Reagan, the conservative, hard-headed, idealistic American president could get Congress and the American people to support the agreements that they might sign. So we now know that Reagan was critical to bringing about the end of the Cold War. In my opinion, he was not nearly so important as Gorbachev, but he was indispensable. He was indispensable because he wanted to engage the adversary and because he worked hard to understand what motivated the adversary and that they had shared common objectives, abolishing nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Leffler. You talked about President Reagan's role and human factors, but other scholars also mentioned the importance of ideas or ideational factors. I don't know whether you agree with this ideational factors contributed to the peaceful ending of Cold War, but if you agree to some extent, can you explain how that kind of approach or that ideational factors contributed to the peaceful ending of Cold War?
Yes, of course. Ideas were very important in terms of bringing about the end of the Cold War. I want to emphasize that I do believe that human agency, individual leaders, were even more critical. I do not think the Cold War would have ended without Mikhail Gorbachev, and I don't think it would have ended without Ronald Reagan. But having said that, let me explain at least three important ideational factors that contributed to the end of the Cold War. First, and I believe most important, was the fact that by the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a growing belief around the entire globe, around the entire world, that communism as a political and economic system was failing. Social democracy in Western Europe, broadly defined, and democratic capitalism in the United States were demonstrating their superiority as a way of life. The Cold War, at its core, the most important aspect of the entire Cold War was that it was a contest of political and economic systems. Bolsheviks and communists believed that capitalism bred inequality, that capitalism bred colonialism and imperialism and war. In contrast, communists believed that state ownership, a command economy, a single-party state could produce a more just, equitable, and peaceful way of life. They claimed that a command economy and a single-party state could nurture modernization, economic development, and educational opportunity. These communist claims in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s resonated. They seemed legitimate because, in fact, in the first half of the 20th century, capitalism had bred 2 world wars and a Great Depression. Peoples all over the globe, East and West, had become demoralized. And after World War II, peoples in Asia and Africa looked to Moscow and to Beijing as models to modernize, industrialize, and prosper. Communist leaders like Nikita Khrushchev sincerely believed that their command economies would outproduce the West and lead to higher standards of living. But that did not happen during the Cold War. lived experience was demonstrating that social democracy and democratic capitalism were superior political and economic systems. As the Soviet economy floundered in the late 1970s and 1980s, and as Eastern European economies stagnated, and as China changed directions after the death of Mao Zedong, people's ideas about the superiority of communism disappeared. Those changing ideas were critical to understanding the end of the Cold War. A second set of ideas I would suggest relates to human rights. The founders of the United Nations inserted a Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. These rights included political rights and economic rights and social rights and cultural rights. The Declaration of Human Rights called for personal freedom, personal security, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. The Declaration called for the right of every human being to medical care, to educational opportunity, to minimum standards of living, to marriage, to family life. For the most part, these rights were ignored for the first 20 years after they were inscribed in the UN Charter. And people in the third world, in Asia and Africa, what was then called the third world, called for the right of self-determination as a human right. These claims went nowhere really for 15, 20, or 20 years. But in the 1960s and 1970s, non-governmental organizations proliferated, and they supported human rights. And they clamored for human rights to be inserted into the Helsinki Agreements of 1975. Key organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch played a critical role. And these groups mobilized public opinion, and they succeeded in getting basic human rights written into the Helsinki Agreements. Eastern European governments in the Soviet Union agreed to it because they secured economic and strategic benefits in return, or so they thought. Communist leaders in the Eastern Bloc did not anticipate that they would honor these human rights. But non-governmental organizations in many countries, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, in East Germany, forced their governments to pay heed. Such organizations existed even inside the Soviet Union and exerted real pressure. And human rights were rights that Gorbachev and his generation of leaders actually understood and embraced. The spread of human rights ideas, I would suggest, however vague they were and however divergent they were in different parts of the globe, were important, very important, in bringing about the end of the Cold War. The last set of ideas, I would stress, related to the peace movement. Soviet leaders, I should say, nurtured their own version of the peace movement throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Soviet leaders called for peace everywhere. They had peace forums, very popular ones, inside the Soviet Union. People from around the world flocked to Soviet peace forums. They wanted to stop, Soviet leaders wanted to use the peace movement to stop the nuclear capabilities of Western nations. But the peace and disarmament movements also flourished in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and Western Europe and Japan, as more and more people around the globe saw the danger of nuclear weapons and feared the prospect of nuclear war. Key scientists, nuclear scientists in the Soviet Union and the United States joined various groups, and they met with one another to discuss the prospects and the technicalities of nuclear disarmament. After new weapons and more sophisticated weapons proliferated in the mid and late 1970s, peace advocates everywhere exerted more and more pressure on governments to step back from the nuclear brink. Some of these groups interacted with and overlapped with the human rights groups, especially in Eastern Europe. Their clamor for peace and disarmament nurtured calls for détente and for the end of two competing blocs. So these three blocks of ideas about the disintegration of the superiority of communism as a political economic system, nuclear abolition, and human rights were key sets of ideas that brought about the end of the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Leffler. It's very enlightening for us as well. And now we'll hear from Dr. Savranskaya. Dr. Savranskaya, floor is yours. Yeah.
It is a great pleasure for me to participate in Jeju Forum, and I would join Professor Leffler in saying that I would much rather like to be there in person, to see your beautiful country. I have never been to Korea, but I appreciate so much your interest in the end of the Cold War and in the Soviet view of the events that were unfolding. I would like to talk more about the Gorbachev's perspective, the perspective of the Soviet elite, the Soviet leaders who were actively engaged in trying to change their own country and the world. I completely agree with Professor Brown to say that ideological conflict, that the Cold War as an ideological conflict certainly ended in the end of 1988. In fact, I would move the end of the Cold War even earlier. I would say that the Cold War ended for many of the Soviet citizens, and I was one of them at the time, when Reagan came to Moscow and he stood on the Red Square and he confirmed when he was asked that his words about evil empire were from another time and another era. And in fact, Reagan at that moment credited Gorbachev with the change in US-Soviet relations. So I would like to talk about what was going on in Moscow and what did the Soviet leaders think. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he certainly did not have a concrete program of change. I think it's very important to keep in mind that Gorbachev went through a very substantial evolution in his thinking, in his policies, in his program. He did not have a concrete program for democratization of the country. He had very strong views about the fact that we cannot go on living like this any longer. He wanted real deep reform, but not the end to socialism and not the end to the Soviet Union. In foreign policy, he also had very strong views. I would say he had maybe more of a program internationally. He wanted to stop nuclear arms race, which did not allow him to take all these resources and put them into economic reform. For that, he wanted to end the Cold War, he wanted to end the regional conflicts, and he deeply believed in engagement. He believed in engagement even with his adversaries. And this is where they were very similar with Reagan. They both believed in their own ideas, and they believed that if only they could meet and speak directly to the adversaries and partners, they could persuade them. At least they could persuade them that they have some common interests and they could work together on those interests. I would like to emphasize, as Professor Leffler did in his presentation, the role of individuals. Of course, the Cold War would not have ended without all the leaders that were already mentioned, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, President Bush. But if you look inside the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was surrounded by a very strong, very bright, very intellectually powerful group of advisors and allies. I would like to name Alexander Yakovlev, Anatoly Chernyaev, who was his closest advisor on foreign policy, and Gorbachev called Chernyaev his alter ego. Georgy Shakhnazarov, Eduard Shevardnadze, and many other assistants. These assistants shared Gorbachev's ideas, and they helped him develop these ideas. In fact, sometimes they were ahead of him. They were more open-minded often. They were more liberal in terms of their foreign policy views, more progressive, you might say. For example, Anatoly Chernyaev. In addition to this set of advisors, people who influenced him, Gorbachev was really able to learn. His ability to learn was truly outstanding. And he learned from his experiences, from the academics whom he gathered very frequently to listen to their advice. He learned from his advisors, whom I named. He learned from foreign partners and even adversaries. And some of the people whom we discussed in the previous presentation, such as Margaret Thatcher, Reagan, also the French President Mitterrand, the Spanish leader Juan Gonzalez, these were the people with whom he talked at length and learned a lot. Professor Leffler mentioned the role of George Schultz, the US Secretary of State. I would also like to mention James Baker, who had long conversations with Gorbachev in 1989, in late 89, but especially 1990, where he explained to Gorbachev how the US capitalist economic system worked. And Gorbachev listened to him. It's very unusual that Gorbachev would be silent for a very long time. He loved to talk, but he would listen to his interlocutors and really learn. One of the lessons, because one of the themes of today's discussion is the lessons, is the lesson of trust. I would argue that the change in the US-Soviet relations and the end of the Cold War to a very large extent depended on the ability of US and Soviet leaders to trust each other. Trust and empathy was growing from the very first meetings, first with Margaret Thatcher in 1984, and then with several summits with President Reagan. I would argue that real achievements, such as US-Soviet arms control achievements, only started after they built trust between Reagan and Gorbachev. And this trust was built on the foundation of nuclear abolitionism. Once Reagan and Gorbachev realized they both believed in the necessity and a possibility to abolish nuclear weapons, they suddenly saw almost a soulmate in each other and began working together and it made such treaties as INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, possible. I would like to say that today in US-Russian discussions, we just recently had a summit, we saw complete absence of trust and even lack of interest in building trust. Both presidents said something along the lines that we really are not talking about building trust. We're just talking about practical national interests. Well, this experience of building trust between Cold War adversaries shows that you really cannot achieve any breakthroughs in your even national interests issue without at least some trust. Now I would like to talk about Gorbachev and Bush administration and the year of 1989, which was probably the most miraculous year of the last at least 50 years, and maybe one of the most miraculous years of my life. If you read American literature on the end of the Cold War, more and more you see the tendency where American scholars and politicians present the developments at the end of the Cold War in a way that credits the Bush administration with ending it. Some people believe that the Bush administration, or this is their interpretation of the evidence, that the Bush administration came to power in 1989 with this grand strategy to end the Cold War and to make Europe whole and free. And that by consistently following that strategy, the United States, in fact, won the Cold War. Not only won the Cold War, the end of the Cold War in Europe, but also won the German unification. Well, this looks very different from the Soviet side. And here's another lesson that I would like to emphasize. And this is something that Mikhail Gorbachev, who is still alive and very active, often mentions in his presentations and articles. He says triumphalism leads to hubris, and triumphalism is morally bad also because it prevents us from learning lessons. So if you look at it from the Soviet side, after all the incredible progress between Reagan and Gorbachev, 1989 starts with a pause. Instead of engaging with Gorbachev and picking up where Reagan left, the Bush administration starts with trying to modernize its short-range nuclear weapons in Europe and does not engage with Gorbachev at all. In fact, it takes almost to the very end of the year to the Malta summit when the Bush administration starts seriously engaging with Gorbachev. Gorbachev was very frustrated with the pause. He kept complaining. He complained to Margaret Thatcher. He complained to Gonzalez. He complained to Mitterrand, to anybody who would listen, to send a message to Bush that time was running out, that they needed to engage and talk about arms control. While the United States and the Soviet Union stood by, unable to engage in dialogue, real changes were happening in Eastern Europe. For some of us, it is still a wonder, it is still unbelievable that the Soviet Union withdrew its weapons and troops from Eastern Europe, essentially gave up its East European empire without force or without even threat of force. It is a puzzle, but it was not really a puzzle for the Soviets. Gorbachev did not want to interfere in East European internal affairs. He really, he was thinking hard, and his advisors were thinking hard, but they tried to find this very sensitive way of slightly pushing East Europeans toward reform, but not interfering, not telling them what to do, and not telling them to remove the old leadership. At the same time, the Soviet leadership, these people around Gorbachev, they made a principled decision very early on that they, under no conditions, they will use force in Eastern Europe. It was just unacceptable to Gorbachev. One of his very strong principles, he was against using force as a tool of foreign policy. So the Soviets undertook a waiting position in 1989. And at first, East Europeans did not believe. Of course, their entire experience with the Soviets created the suspicion, made it very hard for them to believe that Gorbachev, no matter what he says, will not use force. And so they moved very slowly. But after the first democratic elections in Poland in June 1989, the events in Eastern Europe moved very fast. East Europeans finally realized that the Soviets are not going to use force and that they maybe have very small window of opportunity. And they took the matters in their hands and created significant changes in their own countries, eventually leading to the breakup of the Warsaw Pact. And the Soviet Union did not try to interfere at any point. Why? I think a major part of this answer is in Gorbachev's idea of a common European home. Common European home was his main goal of the later years of his foreign policy. He believed that common European home will be the result of the end of the Cold War. Common European home meant collective security in Europe, and it meant deep and full integration of a new democratic Soviet Union back into Europe. Integration on the basis of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which we know as the Helsinki process. Gorbachev did not want to use force in a home where he wanted to live. He was seeing Europe as a natural place for the Soviet Union to integrate. This is also a major reason why Gorbachev agreed to the unification of Germany and did not try to put any obstacles on the way to German unification. And I would end my presentation, and I am willing to talk about other regions of the world in the question and answer session. I would like to end by saying that this grand vision for common European home, for full Soviet and Russian integration, unfortunately did not work. But there are still lessons that we can draw from it, and maybe some of the elements that could still be used in the world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Savranskaya. Thank you for your Soviet perspective and the role of Gorbachev. Actually, Gorbachev, he visited this Jeju island in 1991. And since then, this island is called Island of Peace. And also, he participated in this Jejuporam this year online like you. Well, I have some questions to you, but because of time limit, I will invite Dr. Ha Young-sun first, and he will make comments on the three presentations and his own questions to scholars, all of you. So Dr. Ha, you waited so long. Yeah, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is very much enjoyable for me to have a discussions on the end of Cold War with three globally eminent scholars on these issues on this special occasion of 30th anniversary of President Roh and Gorbachev at this Jeju Island. In addition, yesterday was the 71st anniversary of Korean War, which initiated globalization, Cold War in the world. For our further discussion, considering the conference theme of commemorating the past and preparing for the future, I will focus my discussion on the following questions. Despite the end of the Cold War occurring in 1989 or 1991, why has the Korean Peninsula yet to graduate from the Cold War? To discuss these questions, let me introduce two important meetings. The first is the meeting between the Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze and North Korean Foreign Minister Kim Yong-nam in September 1990. In response to the formal notice of establishing the Soviet Union's diplomatic relations with South Korea, North Korea's Kim Yong-nam strongly criticized Moscow's decision and threatened to develop nuclear weapons in a 6-point memorandum. Since then, North Korea has tried to pursue a triple survival strategy, which gives special emphasis on strengthening international capability through the development of relations with China, the United States, and Japan, and also strengthening self-reliant domestic capability, including nuclear weapons. And thirdly, strengthening unification capability through rapprochement of the two Koreas based on the principle of united front. Under these circumstances, the Korean Peninsula could not successfully experience the same end of the Cold War as the rest of the world. The second meeting I would like to introduce is the meeting between the ROK President Park and US Vice President Agnew in August 1970. Amidst the beginning of détente in East Asia, US Vice President Agnew visited South Korea to assuage South Korea's concern about the withdrawal of US troops from the peninsula. President Park strongly advocated the pre-necessary conditions of assistance for ROK military modernization and the promise to not further reduce troops for the notified US troop withdrawal. Dissatisfied with the détente policy of the United States on the Korean Peninsula, President Park developed a threefold survival strategy comprising of the North police policy toward Russia and China, the local détente effort of the July 4th joint declaration of the two Koreas, and the South Korean type of authoritarian rule against North Korean authoritarianism of Juche, self-reliance. As a result, in spite of the successful rapprochement of the United States and China, local détente between two Koreas faced tragic failure in a short period of time. Looking back at the historical failures during the beginning of détente in the 1970s and the end of the Cold War on the Korean Peninsula, we can learn the following historical lessons. First, the beginning of détente and the end of the Cold War should not be understood with the dichotomous approach of Asian and structural factors. We need to analyze the complex entanglements of Asian and structural factors. In this sense, we should study the Asian factors such as Nixon and Mao in the early 1970s, and also Gorbachev and Reagan in the late 1980s in the context of structural transformation of economic and military factors. In this regard, global and regional détente and post-Cold War did not guarantee local détente and post-Cold War due to the Asian factors such as Park and Kim in the 1970s and Roh and Kim in the early 1990s. Second, regarding the end of the Cold War on the Korean Peninsula, we should develop a much more complex approach comprising of global sanctions against nuclear proliferation, mutual minimum deterrence of both Koreas, global engagement of security and development guarantee of North Korea, and the co-evolution of North Korea's new thinking of survival and prosperity strategy for the 21st century without nuclear weapons. Although I know very well all three of you have worked for a long time on the history of Cold War at the level of global and European level, I am still would like to share your wisdom on the question of failure of the end of Cold War on the Korean Peninsula in the early 1990s, and also what might be the necessary condition for the success of the end of Cold War on the Korean Peninsula in the 21st century. That's the question I would like to raise all three of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ha. Now we have about 15 minutes left now. So I would ask our three scholars to make a short answer to Dr. Ha's question on the Korean Peninsula. In 3 minutes, if you can make your answer, I will appreciate it. Professor Brown, please. And Professor Brown, then Professor Leffler and Dr. Savranskaya. Yeah. Professor Brown, please.
Well, I think it's a difficult question to say the least, especially for those of us whose speciality has not been on Asian politics. But so much depends on the human factors, has been mentioned already. And, you know, if you've not got a leader remotely with an open mind, then it becomes difficult to make progress. And, you know, I would come back to the distinction between the most unusual Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the succession of the dynasty we've seen in North Korea. It's so much more difficult in that case. I think that, you know, the only consistent message that I have, and it seems that the other two speakers from the United States have taken a similar line, that engagement, however difficult it is, must be attempted. And it's never been the case that highly authoritarian regimes become more liberal when they're totally isolated. the extent to which you can break down that isolation, the more chance there is of making progress. Of course, it was unfortunate that the Soviet Union had so little influence over North Korea. At one time, perhaps that didn't matter. In Stalin's time, you might even say it was an advantage. But in the Gorbachev era, the fact that the Soviet Union mattered a great deal for Eastern Europe enabled the East Europeans to take charge of their own destiny. But the Soviet Union under Gorbachev had very little influence indeed in North Korea. So that was a disadvantage. But I come back to the policy of engagement. It's really necessary.
Thank you. And Professor Leffler?
Well, I totally agree with the key point that Professor Brown just made, engagement. And I totally agree with the point that Professor Savronskaya just made earlier about building trust. So a key issue to think about is how do you engage and how do you build trust? The question that you raised, Dr. Ha, about the structural comparisons between North and South Korea, let's say, and East Germany and West Germany is very salient. So one thing I would emphasize, and it was alluded to early on in Professor Brown's comments, and that is détente began not really between the United States and the Soviet Union, but amongst Europeans, and really the important initiatives between East Germany, or I should say between West Germany and East Germany. The Germans themselves made the initial contacts with modest goals to try to begin to nurture trust and to deal with some of the most egregious aspects of human rights violations and reuniting of families and things of that sort, with very modest goals, but it came from the Germans themselves. I think that's one important thing to think about. Another important thing to think about that had enormous impact was the fact that during the 1970s, the East German economy actually became heavily dependent on Western European credits and to some extent American financial credits. But it was the very dependence of Eastern Germany on, broadly speaking, the global economy that had tremendous implications. Now, of course, the East Germans had their own autonomy. They decided to do this for a set of their own complex reasons. It had tremendous long-term ramifications that played out in 1988 and 89. And I think one of the things to think about is how to nurture economic relationships beyond North and South Korea, how to nurture those relationships. Also say another important thing to think about, why you asked such a great question, Dr. Why did things differ in Germany, broadly defined, than in Korea in 1988 and 89? And truthfully, one of the important reasons is the result of the fact that you had a peace movement, that you had non-governmental organizations operating in East Germany. Now, how they came to operate is a very complex issue, and the role of the East German government, in fact, even in acquiescing to the origins of them, is very important, which the North Korean regime clearly has not done. But one of the things that's really important in terms of understanding the end of the Cold War is the result of understanding the role of non-governmental organizations and the peace movement and nurturing ties between individuals and groups. I'm not sure that the solutions start on the state level, because sometimes it's very hard for statesmen to breed trust with one another. But human beings, non-governmental organizations can do a lot over time, long periods of time, to nurture collaboration, cooperation, and eventually trust. Thank you.
And Dr. Savranskaya, please.
I agree with what the previous speakers said, so I will not repeat that, but I would like to emphasize that I think we need three elements for ending the Cold War between the two Koreas. First is engagement. Second is the leaders who are willing to think differently, to learn from each other. And the third is favorable international setting. And unfortunately, I think we are lacking favorable international setting. We're also low on engagement. But I also think that maybe the pandemic that the world is experiencing today, maybe that could be a window of opportunity for these two countries to reach out to each other, to start engagement with some humanitarian actions, and on the basis of that, by very slow steps, to progress toward political and economic engagement. And as far as I understand, the economic situation in North Korea is very dire right now. That also might represent an opportunity. I think that having powerful international partners who are engaged and willing to contribute, like at the end of the Cold War in Europe, you had the United States, you had the Soviet Union, you had major Western powers who were willing to contribute and help end regional conflicts around the world, such as Afghanistan, such as the conflict in Nicaragua, such as the conflict in Southern Africa. You need these great powers, I think, to try to help overcome the Cold War between the two Koreas.
Thank you, Dr. Savranskaya. Dr. Ha, you have any final comment on the questions? No? Yeah. Now we have 5 minutes. So we'll take just 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Is there any question from the audience? Please raise your hand or... yes, please. Yeah. And please indicate to whom you are making the question. Yeah.
Oh, yes. My name is Yoon Sung Cho, and first of all, I want to thank Professor Brown, Professor Leffler, Professor Ha, and Director Savranskaya for their speeches. As a South Korean and as a student who studies international politics, I believe there's a huge difference between East Germany and North Korea. One of the biggest factors is that makes the difference is China. Instead of cooperating for peace and denuclearization of North Korea, they support the Kim regime from behind. They may have less military power than Soviet Union, but I believe they have strength in economy. Other great powers did fear the Red and cooperated in containing the Soviets. But for China, it is difficult to resist their economic power, and some of them even participate in Chinese global project of One Belt, One Road. In short, it is perhaps impossible to make changes in the status quo of in Korean Peninsula without the wills of China. And I believe it is unlikely to happen until China fears of being left out diplomatically. So as experts, what do you think are the measures that Korea can take in the entrance of new Cold War, perhaps? Thank you.
So you want to ask to whom?
Any of the professors.
Any of the professors is
Yes,
very
thank
vague. But
Yes,
Professor
they-
Reffler, can you make an answer to that?
I'll try. I actually agree with what was said in the sense that it is extremely hard to promote any sort of détente, reconciliation, rapprochement with China as a growing adversary. So I'm one of the people around, and I must admit I'm in a minority, who believes that it's extremely important to try to avoid what some people call a new Cold War with China, that it's extremely important to try to nurture a collaborative relationship. I think that many of the things going on in China today are deplorable. But I also believe that that should not thwart, should not stop efforts to cooperate on certain issues of mutual interest. One of the things about Gorbachev and Reagan is that they found a mutual interest. And I believe that there are compelling factors that should nurture cooperation between China and the United States with regard to climate or pandemics, to name the two. But I also think that they might find they have some common interest in promoting healing, reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula as well. So yes, you're right. China is a key, and avoiding another Cold War is a key. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, in this session, as you heard, three renowned scholars, they identified the factors which contributed to the peaceful ending of the Cold War. All three scholars recognized the role of Gorbachev and President Reagan. And Professor Arch Brown stressed the importance of Western engagement with the communist world. And Professor Reffler and Dr. Savranskaya said that understanding and trust grew as a result of direct contact and negotiation between the East and the West. I think this session's lesson for Korean Peninsula situation is the importance of the leader's vision, who can accept different ideas, who have open-mindedness, and the building up of trust and understanding through engagement. I hope these lessons will be faithfully emulated on the Korean Peninsula. And also, I hope that this year, because of pandemic, we should have this kind of online seminar. But next year, we definitely have face-to-face meeting. And if three scholars, you all agree, our Jeju Forum want to invite you to this piece of island of peace, and we'll have face-to-face meeting again next year. So once again, I wish to express my thanks to all of you and the three speakers and Professor Ha, and thank you for joining us. And with this, I conclude this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your insightful and meaningful session. And also thank you very much, our moderator. Please give another big round of applause. Now, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's time to wrap up the session. But before we officially close, I would like to introduce our visual thinking from this session. So let's all have a look. Wow, the writer put all the important contents of this session into visual thinking like this. And thanks to this visual thinking, I think that we can remember this session for a long time. Thank you very much. Like this, we discussed a lot. All right. Wow, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please give another big round of applause. Thank you for your visual thinking. And now this brings us to the end of this event, and I would like to thank all of you once again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your sessions. Thank you very much.